Good morning and welcome back to the Tech23 Impact Circles. And for those new, we welcome you. Thank you all for joining our final online Impact Circle of 2021, supporting our mental health and well-being. As is custom, I would first like to acknowledge both the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and the Bunwurrung and Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land where the Slatterys team meets, works and creates. We pay our respects to the elders, both past and present, always was, always will be, Aboriginal land. Now, today's conversation will be kindly led by Greta Bradman, and she'll be joined by Jane Burns, Joshua Ismin, Dr. Louise Metcalf, and Dr. Prash P. I'd like to make a special shout out to the Tech23 sponsors, Transport for New South Wales, Main Sequence Psylo Innovation Fund, Oz Industry Entrepreneurs Program delivered in partnership with I4 Connect, Addison's, ASX, Ansto, Curtin University, Cicada Innovations, and Evoke AG. We thank you so much for making Tech23 happen. Hi, Rachel. Lovely to see you here this morning.
Oh, hello, Adina, and hello, everyone. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome you and especially welcome our contributors who are helping to make these Tech23 Impact Circles happen. I want to thank all of those who are zooming in to be part of the Tech23 Impact Circles. Please say hello and introduce yourselves in the chat, and you are welcome to share and ask questions in the chat as well. The link to the Slatterys Charter will be found in the chat, which is a guide to the behaviour we encourage at all of our events. Now in its 13th year, Tech23 takes pride in celebrating Australian innovation and is all about amplifying the people and organisations chipping away at the big challenges we face. We've run about 30 of these circles through the times of COVID, and they're all available to watch on demand on our website. And we are also looking forward to a real life event, aren't we, Adina, on the 15th of December in Sydney. So if you want to consider joining us, we will be spotlighting and amplifying and connecting innovators from all across Australia, and we can't wait. Please note today's circle will be recorded. As this is the last circle of the year, I just want to join Adina in thanking our sponsors for backing us to make Tech23 happen any which way this year, and actually last year while I'm at it. And I want to thank all the contributors for sharing with us so generously and for making these circles, for me, and I know for my team, wonderfully reassuring, hopeful and inspiring. And I know there's many others that feel the same in the Tech23 community and beyond. And that's often when I've needed it most. So thank you so much. And just confirming that we're going to eavesdrop on the conversation and then move to Q&A, where you're welcome to come off mute and connect and chat. We'll also stop recording at this time. I'm so grateful and incredibly honoured to hand over the reins to Greta Bradman to kick this very important circle off. Over to you, Greta.
Thanks, Rachel. It is so lovely to be here. I'm on the lands of the Bunwurrung people, and I would like to add my respects to elders past and present also. What a lineup of circle members today we have to talk to. And, you know, I wanted to start by asking the amazing Professor Jane Burns, your thoughts, Jane, on, I suppose, mental health and well-being in today's, I guess, you know, the year 2021, nearly 22, can you believe? But first, just a recap on the World Health Organization definition. I even have it written down on my little card here of mental health, which they penned a couple of decades ago now. They say mental health is a state of well-being in which an individual realizes their own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively, and is able to make a contribution to their community. So, you know, I think until, I don't know, so very long ago, I feel like there was a certain element of almost seeing mental health and conversations about mental health and conversations about mental illness as being very much focused on surviving. But Jane, what do you reckon? How do you think about mental health and well-being, and what are you excited about in today's conversation?
Yeah, thanks, Greta. And I'm so glad that you started with the WHO definition because it takes me back to the original days at Vic Health, where they ran a massive campaign called Together We Do Better, which was really about how do you keep people connected. This is back in the late 90s. How do you keep people connected? And how do you ensure that people have meaning and purpose in life, which is where all of the World Health Organization, that focus on prevention and keeping people mentally fit, healthy and well comes from. So we know pre-COVID, 1 in 4 people experienced a mental health condition across the lifespan. About 50% of people will experience poor mental health. And so I think the big argument we're constantly putting forward is that mental health is just as important as physical health. And your body and your brain aren't disconnected. So the things that you do to look after your body are the things that you do to look after your brain. And like your body, if you put it under stress, you are going to, feel duress and feel stress and potentially end up with a mental illness. So I've been having a look at some of the stats now with the pandemic having hit us. Loneliness is on the increase. Michelle Lim, one of Australia's great researchers, has done a lot of the loneliness research, and people are feeling disconnected. If you look at some of the research that's coming out of the United States from Total Brain, so they've looked at the pandemic pre and in the middle of and now post. They're talking about this thing called micro PTSD. So this ongoing stress and the fact that you're constantly being under duress and you're not feeling as connected as you were. So I think there's a lot that we need to think about in terms of how do we emphasize prevention, but also acknowledge that people do experience mental illnesses, and that we need to think about both prevention, early intervention, treatment and care, and what that care looks like in terms of wraparound support. If you think about some of our most vulnerable people, those that do experience a mental illness, the veteran community, for example, who've been under extreme duress, frontline responders, healthcare workers, there is major cause for concern, but we can't just keep on providing services. We need to think about how we keep people well and get them back into life and work, which brings us back to that definition, which is really about how do we ensure that people flourish, even if they are living with a mental illness.
And there is that 2 continuum model, which I think is gaining, more traction these days, this year, that you can both be living with a mental illness even and flourishing at the same time. And what does that look like? Prash, can I bring you in at this point? You're a medical doctor, a former neuropsychiatry fellow at the Alfred Hospital, just down the road from my digs here in Melbourne. And I'm just wondering, what led you from being there at the Alfred to becoming one of Australia's leading advocates for accessible psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy?
I mean, the irony is that it went the other way. I started life as a surgical trainee and decided to make the switch to psychiatry training so that I could work with psychedelics. It was just sort of a backwards move. But in some senses, that separation is relatively academic. I was reflecting on Jane talking earlier about and that WHO definition of mental health and well-being. But even that definition sort of keeps us rooted in that Cartesian dichotomy. And we'll still suffer the hangover of that Cartesian duality of separating mind from body, and that there's mental health and then there's physical health, as opposed to the idea that health is health. And the separation of symptomatology is purely a manufacturing of our own mind and the way society has defined us. And equally, I guess, on a similar sort of tangent, that idea that there's individual health, and that it can exist in a silo, and that people should be treated individually, as opposed to considering the idea that individual health is community health and community health is individual health, and it's impossible to separate the two or imagine that you can achieve one without necessarily achieving the other. And last year, if anything, is a great depiction of how that sort of communal impact affects us individually and vice versa. I recognize I've gone on an immense tangent, but thank you for allowing
not
me.
at all. I mean, do you think that there is a more appreciation, maybe through COVID, and I really want to bring Louise and Josh on board in just a sec, but Prash, a bit of a shift towards recognizing, I suppose, more of a systems level approach to mental health and well-being, and perhaps, you know, well-being taken in the most holistic kind of definitional sense as integrating both physical and mental health. Have you seen that? Is there more sort of a systems approach, and do you think that in some ways the tech world can support that?
I think there's certainly, I mean, but the first thing is there has been a greater recognition of the need for concern or attention to mental health. I think that's the first thing that's come up, because it's become so apparent that everyone has suffered through this significantly. It's a little unfortunate that it's taken suffering, that it's taken not lack of well-being to sort of bring to the forefront the need for well-being. But also the fact that so many of our usual outlets, activities and distractions that would have otherwise supported our well-being being pulled out and away from us means that there has been a need to focus on other means of establishing that well-being. And I think that's a good thing. I think people have, to some extent, gotten out more as much as they can. I know certainly we've been walking a lot more, walking in parks a lot more, and I don't think that's ever a bad thing. But that's just an example, I guess, of the fact that we've had to deviate from our usual sort of status quo mechanisms and try and find other means of establishing health and well-being. And if we can take that into the future rather than just leave it behind us as a COVID thing, I think that would be excellent for the community at large.
Louise, how about you? I mean, Dr. Louise Metcalf, you've got over 30 years experience as a psychologist, and you've created Gheorg. You're the founder and CEO of Gheorg. What is Gheorg, and how does Gheorg help kids, and what have you seen kids going through through COVID?
Yeah, so Gheorg is the little virtual robot who helps kids 7 to 12 years old with anxiety and to build resilience. Gosh, we saw a lot of activity with Gheorg over the lockdowns, particularly. And as kids started to come back to school, there was just a lot of stress around the change of that, and also the virus and health of family. So kids have really, really suffered during the lockdowns. Absolutely. Loneliness was very big, missing friends, obviously, missing sport activities. You know, kids have really suffered, and the stress is sort of ongoing. The kids of today too are super smart, right? I think they're smarter than my generation ever was. They're following along with the news quite a bit. So they're worried about the weather. You know, they know the vaccination rates. You know, they're amazing. So Gheorg really helps to kind of, you know, help them manage those sort of big emotions, and particularly anxiety, which has been absolutely rife. Yeah.
Josh, how about you? You're co-founder and CEO of Psylo, and you're a repeat founder and tech entrepreneur. Oh, by the way, I should say that if you are, I'll just pop it again in the chat, just in case anyone has come on a little bit later and it's not appearing in your chat. You can have a look at the bios of the circle members today if you're interested, just by clicking on the link in the chat. So Josh, how about you in founding Psylo, and you were in StartMate? I think Psylo has been involved in StartMate.
Yeah,
the
we
Blackbird.
did.
Yeah.
That's right.
What do you think about the COVID? And I'm sorry if you can hear my 5-month-old. You probably can't see her, but I have at my feet a 5-month-old enormous German Shepherd puppy who's making very contented little groaning sounds every now and again, so apologies. What have you seen through COVID in terms of funding opportunity, excitement around ideas that really bring together, I suppose, solutions that look to work with the issues around mental health and well-being and tech?
Yeah, so we launched Psylo, which is a psychedelic drug development company, in lockdown. So, I mean, I started networking in academia to find researchers and scientists that were interested in psychedelic medicines, and found my co-founder at Sydney University. And, you know, one of the things that COVID has really meant is that everything is on the table now. people are really looking at mental illness, mental health in an entirely new way. I think in a lot of ways, cannabis kind of paved the way for a lot of this thinking, but everyone being stuck in their houses without anywhere to go, and like also imagining, the most vulnerable people in our society, how are they surviving in this period? It's really allowed for really creative new ideas in technology and otherwise to sort of come to the forefront. Psychedelic medicine has entirely been sort of legitimized as a result of that. So, I was actually really surprised. I thought when we kicked off fundraising for the business that, people would laugh and it would be like, oh, you're this kooky sort of, granola person. No, it was really exciting. There was a huge amount of attention. And, like Michael Pollan's book really helped and a number of other cultural factors. But like, I think COVID and lockdown really sort of like everyone in the investment community is sort of looking for new ideas, new approaches. And it's sort of like, let's throw out the old paradigm. And we've had 40, 50 years of prohibition. That's certainly not working.
And if you're on the call and you're thinking, Michael Pollan, who is that? I entreat you to read How to Change Mind, Michael Pollan. It totally changed my mind and opened it to the world of psychedelics. And I am a psychologist. So I think that, we have a long way to go in terms of that. So Jane.
Yeah, Greta, and just to add to that, again, I knew very little about psychedelics until the guys from My Medicines Australia got in touch with me, and having, chaired Open Arms, the Veterans Families Counselling Service for the last, coming up to 7 years now, and really having conversations with veterans and their family members about what do new treatments look like and what technologies are available. I would absolutely second that. The community is ready for evidence-based, high-quality treatments that actually wrap around and consider their life, consider them in the context of their lives. I've seen the same thing happening in the tech innovation space, particularly around entrepreneurship and innovation. And when you think about some of the work that's being led by veterans, Swiss 8's one, how do we actually create community around connecting people, and it not being about the broken veteran, but it actually being about how do we actually support people to thrive. In the middle of both COVID lockdown, 1 in Melbourne and then 6 in Melbourne, I had the privilege of bringing together, we're now at 70 plus organisations who are committed to working together around tech innovation and artificial intelligence and virtual reality and augmented reality. But what's really interesting is it's not all tech like it was when we did the Young and Well CRC. It's actually tech-human interaction. Tech, human, plus how do you actually get the great wraparound support that you need? How do you actually upskill a workforce so that it's not just a psychology workforce, even though you need that workforce, but how do you actually create peer networks? How do you create support that actually looks at the different roles that people play? And I'll finish, I know I'm rabbiting on, but what's been really fascinating for me as mum to 3 kids, and I absolutely agree completely with Louise and the families that I've had conversations with, my 2 little ones absolutely were isolated and not connected. My eldest, Angus, though, lives with quite a severe disability. So he had 3 carers who were all trainee nurses who would come in, take him out into the community. I was chatting to Kyla, one of the girls yesterday, and I've seen him just flourish as a young man. But what's been really interesting for these trainee nurses is that they've said the same. For them, it's been a saving grace that they've actually been able to provide this care workforce and actually create opportunities for people with a disability to connect. So there's sort of silver linings on some of this stuff. As much as you hate going through this idea of a massive global pandemic, the fact that we've now got a light shining on different approaches to creating well communities and also thinking about our most vulnerable, I think is probably a really great thing.
Louise, I can see you nodding.
Yeah. I just want to say that, it's been great, COVID, in a very big way for mental health. And that is it shone a light on the gaps. I've been in psychology for so long, I can tell you that we have been screaming about those gaps that whole time, even when I was a trainee, I remember these conversations, but it was falling on deaf ears, clearly, or mostly deaf ears maybe. But now it's actually being talked about. The gaps became front of mind. And as a result, yeah, people leapt in. It was wonderful to see the number of people jumping in, saying, what about this, and try this, and how about this, and what if I did this? Like in the communities, neighbors chatting over the fence and making ways to keep the communication going. The spoon families, I don't know whether that popped up in your neighborhood, but that was, wonderful to see people doing that, and it's just, we've been rabbiting on about loneliness, I think, since the 60s, I think. And it was just wonderful to see that coming to the fore and people jumping in, solutions being provided, even if, yeah, it was wooden spoons painted with faces. Quite wonderful.
Josh, I can see you've got your hand up.
I just was wondering if anyone in the group had any thoughts on what I've come to think of as the sort of happiness gap. So like Australia has some of the highest ranking cities in the world with respect to lifestyle and happiness, but also is the second highest consumer of antidepressants of all OECD countries. And I was just wondering if anyone had any ideas on why that is, or sort of any sort of potential solutions.
I'd love, Prash, to hear your thoughts on this. I can see the mind whirring.
I would love to say something positive about this, but I don't necessarily. And yes, Australia is quite remarkably high, but I think you will find a lot of developed nations being quite distinctly high on that list. There's been a greater understanding over time, and some of this comes from addiction literature, for example, where for the longest time addiction was seen as a biological disorder or a disease, but over time there's been a greater recognition of the psychosocial determinants of addiction, and with that the psychosocial determinants of all mental health and well-being, and that includes crucially things like a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, a sense of community, interpersonal relationships, the things that are so often ignored when we often conventionally think about mental health and mental well-being. And in more developing countries, particularly some of those metrics like sense of community, interpersonal relationships, are far more deeply entrenched as part of day-to-day life. That idea of it takes a village to raise a child is a foreign concept in a place like Australia. But if I go back to where my ancestors come from, the villages of Sri Lanka, for example, yeah, of course it does. It's the only way you raise a child. Or even not going that far back, but yeah, even going back to my parents' generation, there was communities in the suburbs where that's how they raised the child. And I think the more developed we get, and the more siloed we get, that tends to be a larger and larger issue that we're going to face.
If I might sort of posit, I suppose, some reflections on this too. One of the things I find I'd be interested in others' perspectives on Martin Seligman's, very broad PERMA model, or PERMA plus these days. So PERMA, P-E-R-M-A, it's an acronym: positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, achievement. And then the plus is all around the physical. So physical activity and the role that plays in really flourishing and, moving past this idea of mental health and wellbeing being about surviving, returning us to baseline, which I suppose could be argued is the role of medication, particularly. Louise, I don't know about you, but as a psychologist, someone who's not, for myself, someone who's not in a position to ever prescribe medication, I can say I started out quite anti-medication, and then along the way came to recognize that it can play a really important role in opening one up to the sort of the more cognitive and behavioural processes of sort of habituating towards something more functional that can then lead someone towards maybe putting the medication to the side if that's appropriate, and moving on. Louise, what is your sort of experience of that space?
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think, you know, if we think back through our collective training there's a lot of messages about medication sort of being secondary really to the therapies, and for good reason. We deliver the therapies, right? So it does make sense. But as you get into practice, you learn more, obviously with your awesome supervisor, the relationship that medication alongside therapy plays, particularly for people who are really struggling and they need that little bit of extra to kind of start the therapies. So yeah, absolutely. But on the upside, I think, you know, in my experience over all those decades, is that psychologists in Australia are some of the most open to trying as much as we can. You know, I think we were one of the first in the world to start using apps with clients. So we're certainly, you know, the most you know, determined to try and find the solutions for people, find things that actually work. And as a result, we're very eclectic, you know, and very science driven. And, you know, I think every psychologist is subscribed to, you know, 50 journals and doing a second master's degree. You know, we're very determined to find those answers. So I have been following along with the with psychedelic assisted therapy, and I certainly have clients who are keen to sign up. But I'm really keen to learn more, as I'm sure a lot of psychs out there are. So there's a lot of possibilities, I think.
Josh, how have you found engagement with, you know, you mentioned that when you were setting up Psylo, you really set out to engage with the academic community. How have you found that process on the on the, I suppose, the therapist side and the interest on that side?
So mostly at the moment, since we're R&D, we're engaging with, you know, academic institutions. We're looking to set up a lab at a university and currently negotiating terms on that. We're talking with, you know, CSIRO and STO about research collaborations and partnerships and joint funding and stuff like that. There hasn't yet been a need to engage really deeply with clinicians at this stage. But we certainly have some in our orbit, including Prash, as well as Margaret Ross down at St. Vincent's in Melbourne, among others. So, I mean, we do have in our Notion setup, which is like our internal wiki, you know, we have a tracker of clinical trials that are happening, and the ones that are sort of like the most interesting, we're reaching out to the lead researchers. And, you know, just generally, we're on a bit of a networking offensive because we're trying to recruit medicinal chemists and preclinical pharmacologists, et cetera. But yeah, it's been less sort of clinical application at this stage because we're earlier than that.
Jane, I can see your hand up, but would you mind just if I just grabbed a comment from Prash just around psychedelics and where you see the appetite in Australia landing at the moment?
Sorry. Yeah, just to connect from the previous point that was raised about medication, so I can connect through to psychedelics. And this is coming from someone who can prescribe and does prescribe. There is a role for medication, particularly in stabilization. But I think one way I've always looked at it is I've often described antidepressants to being like training wheels on a bicycle. And sometimes it's necessary, right? Sometimes you're learning to ride the bike and you need those training wheels, or the ground gets really unsteady and you need those training wheels. But you got to learn to ride the bike. Because if not, at some point when you take those training wheels off, you're going to fall over. Or if the ground gets too bumpy, training wheels or not, you're going to fall over. And you need to learn to ride the bike. But learning to ride the bike is hard. Therapy is hard. It's hard work. It takes takes months, it takes years, it requires sitting with a considerable amount of discomfort. And it's not an easy route. And psychedelics and psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, it's not to say it's easy. In fact, it's incredibly hard work. And people often think it's just about taking, just taking some mushrooms and then feeling better. If that was the case, then Burning Man and Rainbow Serpent Festival would be the greatest sort of group therapy sessions that exist, but we know that that is not the case. The magic is in the psychotherapy, the work is in the psychotherapy, which is hard in a very different way. It doesn't take as long perhaps, but it's often far more intensive, and that's why the change is so significant. And it's kind of why I got really involved in it. Josh, you're lucky in a way in terms of coming into it at this point in time, where the world has started to open up to psychedelics. This has been my soapbox for about 7 to 8 years, and probably the first 5 years was a lot of banging my head against the wall, talking to scientists, talking to clinicians. It was really hard to get across. I mean, the stigma is pretty deep rooted. And scientists or not, it takes some time to sort of start opening those doors. And over the last 2 years, there has been a significant shift, to the extent that now I have the college inviting me to speak about psychedelics, whereas it took about 4 years of rejections of my attempts to speak at the conference. So it's been a very distinct shift. I find myself now in a position where Enosis Therapeutics, which is my my startup in the psychedelic space, is looking to marry virtual reality technology and psychedelic therapy. And I find myself, from where I stood on the fringes, no longer being on the fringes, I now find myself again on the fringe of the fringe, in trying to convince people that there's merit to this. This isn't maybe the forum to go into that in too much depth, maybe just yet. But anyway, those are my thoughts about the slow moving pace of change.
That's amazing. And can I just say, Prash, that I think that coming together of those two things, I mean, psychedelics, and even again, total novice, newbie, read Michael Polk's book and then followed up with some research articles and other things as a result of just finding that so interesting. But one thing that I absolutely took away was the importance of the guidance and and the journey that one goes on through that that psychedelic assisted therapy. So having that combination just sounds magic, really, really potent.
Can I just?
I'm happy to talk more about.
I was just going to say, I'm not sure if any of you guys saw the announcement that Monash was approved for a world first clinical trial for psychedelic assisted therapy, where the clinicians will actually also have the opportunity to be dosed so that they're able to relate to the patients and sort of, help guide them through that experience. That's amazing. It's a huge breakthrough world first. So just wanted to call that out.
Absolute world first. Yeah. Jane, thanks for being so patient.
No, I was just reflecting on, Greta, your point around positive psychology and Martin Seligman. And Louise, you'll probably remember this back in the day when we were all training as babies coming through the system. And I remember the book came out, Preventive Interventions in Mental Disorders, and it was all about promotion, prevention, early intervention, treatment, relapse. And it included holistic approaches to thinking about mental health and well-being, but it was always on the premise of make sure that the science is behind this. And I remember starting to think about the positive psych stuff and reading Seligman's work and the publications, but there was a real pushback from traditional medicine and psychology around positive psychology. And then suddenly it started to get a bit more traction, and people like Diane Vella-Broderick at Melbourne Uni and Paula Robinson, who's done her PhD on mental fitness. The science is compelling, and it feels like this weird sense of competition between almost medicine versus psychology versus new treatments versus community-based care. And I just keep coming back to, if we don't think about how we bring together industry and universities with SMEs and the new ways of working and new ways of thinking and trialing and testing, we're still going to be stuck back in the, that old age of the medical model, and this is the treatment paradigm, and this is the way in which we provide treatments, which is quick and easy antidepressant. And I think, Prash, you know, your comments around the hard work is absolutely right. You know, it's probably easier for a GP to provide a antidepressant. It's probably easier to provide sleeping tablets. Remember all of that sort of early conversations, and you're thinking, this is about our health and our well-being. We don't go out and run a marathon without training. You don't become an elite athlete without training. You know, you don't turn up for life. And I was been reflecting on Maslow's hierarchy. You know, you need to go through that process of motivation to keep yourself going. And it's like that in physical and mental health. And I think that's the thing that I think is probably the most exciting at the moment, that people are actually starting to question, how do we do better at this? How do we actually get together and pool our resources and pool our thinking and challenge each other and have those conversations about, actually, we do want a better world.
Do you think that, and this goes to something that Josh actually said the other day around, you know, this idea of COVID having, I suppose, spurred us on to think more broadly and rethink our relationship with our mental health and well-being. What is that? What do we need in order to look after it? Really looking beyond ourselves and looking at the context, because I feel like the sort of the biomedical model is very much, you know, grounded in the individual, almost the individual as an island. And if there's one thing that COVID has done, it has really shine a spotlight on how interconnected our mental health is. Louise, I can see you nodding.
Yeah, this is it's a really interesting phenomenon, isn't it? Like going back to Jane's point about Seligman, in my training, it was very behaviorist, and then, you know, the cognitive part was kind of introduced. Yep, that's how old I am, and and it was, you know, that was controversial. But Seligman, you know, in the 70s was starting to go, oh, I think I should be studying happiness, right? So, and he was super controversial. He had, you know, really stand-up arguments with the American Psychological Association. He was super controversial in his approach and really had to turn people's heads around in terms of thinking of a continuum of mental health. So yes, you can be very unwell, but your brain can also be very, very well. And we need to think about how we move people along the continuum of this. So we've sort of taken a long time, really, to recognize the value of that. Actually, I remember reading his first book, which he openly admits is his absolute worst book, but I think is brilliant, a really brilliant, groundbreaking book. And here we are trying to think, you know, how do we put these pieces together? I think in academia, also, you know, what Jane was mentioning there really is a bit of a tendency in psychology to be a bit more dinosaur-like. There are some amazing academics out there really pushing the boundaries and doing amazing things. But I think en masse, the education standards are still hanging back a bit in quite old psychology. So there is a need to kind of push the academic and the scientific side forward a bit, make it a bit more dynamic, a bit more, you know, embracing modern methods. Our data processes are still survey based. I think that's kind of a very clear indicator that, yeah, we're still hanging back a bit. But as a community, as a society, we have, like, you know, these sort of millennial generations. I'm a Gen X, so I think you can add Gen X in there.
Yeah. Now, can I just take this opportunity to say that if you're listening and you have a question, please post it in the chat, because we're going to turn to any questions that you have soon. We can get to them through actually talking about them, or if you have a question for a particular circle member, you can pop it in the chat and they will write back to you. So really go for it in terms of any questions that you might have. But I wanted to, I suppose, touch on this idea of, you know, for instance, positive psychology. I feel like today it's pretty integrated into a couple of the sort of the third wave psychotherapies. So you've got DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, you've got ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, which would be probably the two that that I am the most trained in myself, but you might have others. What I'd love to open up the discussion around is, do you think that, and this is going to Jane, something that that you mentioned around how can we harness tech to elevate and provide something more than we can provide face to face? So I want to talk about network effects. I want to talk about this idea of, if we're talking in clinical space of working one-on-one with an individual, and this might be because someone comes in and says, I feel disconnected from myself and I feel okay, but I just really want to level up with being more connected to, you know, what feels like a really great aligned life for myself. Or it might be someone coming in and saying, I have severe anxiety. So it can be, you know, in either, in the tech space, how can we move past the user one and user one and user one and start thinking about, what does user 10 provide user one? And how can we actually start to generate communities through tech that can in some way have a network effect towards, I suppose, positive contribution along mental health and wellbeing? Any thoughts? Big question.
I'll jump in.
Jane, I can see you.
Yeah, I know. But I feel like I'm monopolizing, but
you're not.
To that question, reachout.com was started in Australia in 1997, and that was all about reaching out and connecting young people to each other because of our challenges of regional remote. Fast forward to today, and I noticed Doug's on from Sahar. For example, Together AI, which is artificial intelligence helping parents have conversations with kids about, you know, things that are challenging to have a conversation about. They built out a database of families, of 20,000 families within 2 months. It was extraordinary to watch because people are really wanting to connect. And it wasn't about psychology and clinical care, it was about conversations and community. And I think to pick up on Prash's point, you know, we have been incredibly lucky with the technologies that we've had. You know, Hello Sunday Morning started back in 2009-10, Smiling Mind, same time. Young and Well was funded to do amazing prevention right through to clinical care. And the technologies back then were nothing like they are today. I sort of look at it and go, artificial intelligence, human-computer interaction, virtual reality. You know, we've got some great VR technology partners in the Well and Productive CRC. It is the way of the world. It's not taking away from psychologists or GPs, it's actually enhancing the experience. And that to me has always been, it's not that the tech's the answer, it's that the tech plus people is the answer. And people at the end of the day are wanting human connection. You know, if you look at the United Project and the conversation we had a few weeks ago around loneliness, it is about connection. It's about feeling meaning and purpose. And that comes back to that basic hierarchy of needs that Maslow created back in the 50s. Yeah, we've got to keep people safe and well, but we really want them to get to the stage where they're actually saying, how do I turn up to be my best person? And I think that's particularly exciting in the tech space.
Prash, how about you? Like, what are some of the most exciting technologies that you see emerging to be of utility in the mental health space?
It's hard when you're down at the bottom of a particular rabbit hole to necessarily emerge from it. So I am going to speak from my little rabbit hole.
Absolutely, it's a great place to be.
It's quite comfortable down here. I mean, two of my big rabbit holes are psychedelics and virtual reality, and obviously the combination of the two. I see psychedelics as a technology. I don't think it fits into conventional understanding of definitions of technology. Yes, it doesn't have semiconductors and transistors, and it's not run on the Solana blockchain, but it is, it has the power to produce immense change in terms of processes and functional outcomes, and does require that human interface. The fact that it's a really old world technology doesn't make it any less of a technology. It's just technology that we're starting to learn and understand how to engage with more and more. And so for me, that is incredibly exciting. Virtual reality on its own, Jane touched on it a little bit, but has tremendous potential, both as a standalone, and some like specific case examples are the use of virtual reality in exposure and desensitization therapy for people with obsessive compulsive disorder, for example, allowing people with post-traumatic stress disorder to start to revisit traumas in a very graduated fashion through a virtual reality landscape, mind-blowingly useful. And but even on a more communal sense, like Zoom for me has actually been one of the most important technological innovations that has for mental health that has emerged during COVID, right? Because it helped to establish a sense of connectivity amongst people. Virtual reality allows you to do that same thing, but without necessarily this sort of set apart interface of the computer screen, but in a completely immersive environment. And there are certainly projects. There's David Glowacki, for example, who's working on a project of attempting to connect people as almost sort of entities in the virtual world, and allowing that sort of, without trending too far into the esoteric, allowing an energetic connection between people around the world in the virtual reality space. That for me is fascinating. And then there's the work that Enosis Therapeutics is doing, which I will trumpet as my own trumpet, in trying to combine both of these technologies in trying to use all of these benefits of virtual reality technology to modulate, optimize, improve the efficacy, and improve the tolerability of the psychedelic therapy experience, which is novel, and is being recognized for it. But we see enormous potential for this in the future. I'll just stop there.
Josh, how about you? Do you think, how would you love to see tech and biotech really elevated over the next, in the space of mental health and well-being? What do you think its role be?
Yeah, so I come from digital media sort of platforms, et cetera. Moving into biotech, I started as an investor, and it was sort of ethically minded. I was investing in all protein, clean meat businesses, and that's sort of how I got into biotech. And one of the things that I've learned in going down this journey is that biotech has changed tremendously, even just in the last couple of years. So right now, our business, Psylo, is running as a virtual drug development company where, at the moment we're in a co-working space in Chippendale, but actually there's 30 chemists in China and in the US that are actually working in labs, synthesizing and screening molecules that we've designed. So that sort of model has not existed before. There's also robotic applications for the screening where, you can do like screening at scale it just wasn't possible, and it certainly wasn't affordable even really recently. So like the sort of technical applications for biotech are tremendous. For mental illness medications is sort of the rabbit hole that I'm in right now. I tend to be I know this is a tech conversation, but like in my own life, after spending several months looking at nothing but a screen, I'm trying to avoid tech in any way that I can at the moment. But like I always go back to this article that I read. The founder of Wired magazine talks about technology as something that makes your life better, but is kind of invisible and sort of, it doesn't create additional sort of hurdles for you in terms of being able to actually be present and enjoying your life. So I'm really hopeful that, great entrepreneurs will continue innovating and developing ways for tech to be better, but sort of like just less in my face. And I'm sure there's wearable technology and AI and other things that are going to have tremendous applications for achieving that.
Absolutely. And I think also in the world of work and, like providing a stopgap for the wait period before someone can get into an EAP. I'm really excited about startups coming in and filling that space. We are pretty much out of time. I'm going to hand back to Rachel in a minute, but Louise.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to that point about, user 10, and what they provide to user one around this sort of, mental health tech versus devices, right? Or, sort of regular working technology, etc., right? I think what mental health tech will do is it will push device manufacturers and other app creators to think about the effects on mental health of what they're creating. We've seen that a little bit already with Instagram, but I think it's going to get a heck of a lot bigger. And I'm very excited to see, all of us using devices that are actually mentally healthy. I think they're going to be very different to the ones that we have now, but I can't wait to see what that would eventually look like.
I think we'd all agree with that. Thank you so much, Circle people. Rachel, back to you.
Oh, thanks so much, Greta. That was a fantastic conversation to eavesdrop on. And I noticed there's a couple of questions coming up on the chat. We are recording this, but I think we'll stop recording now so people can feel freer about some of the things they might want to ask. For those that have to jump off the line, thank you so much for joining us. And remember, this will be available for you to share far and wide with others that you think could benefit from this or any other circle. And I want to thank the contributors so much for sharing their expertise, knowledge, perspectives, experience. It was just wonderful. Thank you so much for what was an informative circle.